the key message was being sent to Europe. Putin chose to fire the Oreshnik intercontinental ballistic missile, a nuclear-capable missile, at Lviv, at the Lviv region, very close to the border with the European Union and NATO. Now, of course, he could have fired this anywhere if he wanted to make a demonstration to show his frustration with the peace process, or to punish Ukraine, as they claimed they were trying to do, or whatever excuse he may have come up with. But it was very clear, I think, that they chose this target so close to NATO and the EU to send a message to Europe, like, be careful, essentially.
While Russia continues its missile attacks on Ukraine, European leaders are discussing the possibility of dialogue with President Putin. Joining me now is Peter Dickinson, British journalist, editor of UkraineAlert at the Atlantic Council and the publisher of Business Ukraine magazine. Peter, welcome to our program.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to join you again.
I want to start with the question about this idea of French President Emmanuel Macron, and then supported by Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. She said that Europe should resume talks with Putin and actually to maintain its influence in negotiations over ending the war against Ukraine. And actually the statement came just after huge missile strike on Ukraine, leaving millions of people without heat, electricity and water. Why do you think European leaders are pushing for a dialogue with Russian dictator at this time?
Well, I think it's all to do with Trump. Trump has basically forced them into this position. For a long time, the united position of all the West, of all the democratic world, was to not have dialogue with Putin, to maintain this sort of isolation of the Russian regime. But Trump has broken that very emphatically. I mean, Trump literally rolled out the red carpet for Putin in August in Alaska, and very, very publicly ended this policy of isolation. So really, since then, it's been a matter of time. And the European leaders are very conscious that at the moment, they're being sidelined, they're being bypassed in negotiations, which essentially will define the future of Europe. So of course, the talks are very important for America. Obviously, they're crucially important for Ukraine. They're very important for Russia as well. But this is essentially what's being discussed between the Americans and the Russians at the moment is European security. So the Europeans find themselves in a position where they're bystanders in processes that will define how they live for the coming decades, perhaps. So, they really, I think that their hand has been forced, and they recognize, okay, we've got to get back into this process. We can't allow this to go on without our involvement. And so one of the tools they have is to re-engage with Russia directly themselves and to have a channel there. I'm not sure it's something they would have done otherwise, but I think Trump really has forced them to take this step.
I think it's also worth to mention the question about readiness of Putin, to have such a dialogue with European leaders, especially as we saw in the end of last year, as Putin called them and used not very pleasant words for them. Do you think Putin is ready?
Putin will probably talk to them at some level. He may initially reject the talks and then he may engage with them. It's valuable for Putin to demonstrate that efforts to isolate him have failed. This has been a very prominent Kremlin narrative since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, that it's futile, essentially, to try and isolate a power as important, as central to global politics as Russia, that these efforts will fail. So Putin has been pushing that narrative. The Kremlin in general has been pushing this idea of the futility of trying to isolate Russia. So in order to emphasize that argument, I think they might be tempted to go in for talks. But if we're talking about how this process of peace talks or negotiations about a possible settlement will proceed, I think that the Kremlin will certainly try to keep Europe absolutely in a secondary role. This is all about Russia and America. This is all about Russia underlining its status, about Putin underlining his status as a world leader and Russia's status as a superpower. And superpowers deal with each other. They don't deal with middling powers, as it were. Europe is not seen as a significant superpower at this stage. It has the potential to be so, but at the moment it's very disunited. It's a collection of states, a kind of Holy Roman Empire of the modern era almost. It doesn't have the weight to stand at the same level as far as Putin's concerned with the Americans and the Russians. So Putin's been very clear. He wants to deal with the Americans here, and he'll continue to do so. Ukraine will be involved as a kind of almost as an afterthought, as the Americans' problem, as it were, for the Russians. But the Europeans will not be afforded equal status in talks. I think we can say that with a high degree of certainty.
After one of the heaviest attacks on Ukraine these days, do you think the reaction from European countries, Ukraine's main allies, have been sufficient enough?
Well, I haven't seen any reaction. Was there a reaction? I didn't see any reaction.
Only
of course,
comments.
I exaggerate, but they said they didn't like it, which is obviously completely futile, very ineffective. I mean, we've seen this a million times. The Europeans don't react with any great force. They certainly don't impose costs on the Russians. This is where the impunity comes from. And I think this is particularly telling this time because this latest attack, was very much directed against Europe. It was, of course, as usual, Russia was targeting Ukrainian civilians, was bombing Ukraine, but the key message was being sent to Europe. Putin chose to fire the Oreshnik intercontinental ballistic missile, a nuclear-capable missile, at Lviv, at the Lviv region, very close to the border with the European Union and NATO. Now, of course, he could have fired this anywhere if he wanted to make a demonstration to show his frustration with the peace process or to punish Ukraine, as they claimed they were trying to do, or whatever excuse he may have come up with. But it was very clear, I think, that they chose this target so close to NATO and the EU to send a message to Europe, be careful, essentially. So you have the Europeans saying, we're going to provide security guarantees for Ukraine, and Putin immediately lashes out and unleashes this nuclear-capable missile right on the border of Europe, just to send a message to them saying, you better be careful because I'll strike you back, and I'm dangerous. Don't take liberties here. And the European reaction so far has been negligible, apart from the usual condemnations. I think until we get to the stage where European countries impose costs on the Russians for each war crime they commit in Ukraine, for each aggressive gesture that they make, for each aggressive signal they send to Europe, the Russians will be very comfortable with the status quo and will continue as they are with this sense of impunity.
I will not ask about the reaction of Americans, of Donald Trump, because he's, as usual, very friendly with Putin, but he has made some comments suggesting fatigue with Putin, and yesterday journalists even asked if he sees a scenario similar to Maduro in Venezuela. Do you foresee increased pressure on Putin from the US, especially if we see there is no political will from Russia to really have fruitful negotiations to end the war against Ukraine? And do you see a Maduro-style scenario for Putin?
Well, I think we can immediately completely rule out a Maduro-style scenario for Putin. That's not going to happen. But there are signs that Trump is becoming less enamored with Putin, less impressed by Putin. I think, there's always been a lot of suspicions about the nature of this relationship between Trump and Putin. And in particular, a lot of people have felt that, maybe Putin really does have some compromise on him. Maybe he really does have some compromising materials or some leverage on him, because Trump's behavior is so inexplicably pro-Kremlin, pro-Russian. But I think probably an equally plausible explanation is simply that he simply likes Putin. He likes the dictatorial form of government. He's enamored by the idea of a strong leader like Putin, and he thinks that Vladimir Putin is a model that he would like to aspire to. But that appeal is wearing a little bit thin now, I think, because he's starting to see that behind it all, behind the facade of strength, there's not a lot there. With the American actions in Venezuela really exposed the fundamental geopolitical weakness of Russia's position now, Russia's inability to stand up for itself. I presume that the decision to go in and get Maduro was preceded by a lot of analysis about what Russia may or may not do. And the American intelligence community obviously decided Russia wasn't going to do anything, and they were right. Their assessment was entirely accurate. Russia did nothing. They stood down, essentially, after having just within weeks of that operation, the Russians were still saying, we're going to protect Venezuela. We are not going to allow America to do this, that, or the other. But when push came to shove, Moscow was silent. And then, to add insult to injury, as it were, from Putin's point of view, the Americans then seized the Russian-flagged oil tanker in the North Atlantic, which the Russians had said directly, do not do this. The Russians had sent naval forces to defend that vessel, but the Americans seized it anyway. And again, Russia's response was to back down and retreat with their tails very publicly between their legs and sort of scuttle away. So I think that probably Trump is looking at that thinking, this strongman Putin is not actually much of a strongman. He's actually a lot weaker than I thought he was. And I would imagine there is a degree of a loss of respect there. Now, if you tie that in as well with the very, very open lying that Putin's engaged into Trump recently, the lie that he told Trump directly about the attack on his residence, which Trump then came out and echoed and repeated to the whole world. I think that's another factor that's going to make Trump think, I can't trust this guy. He's weaker than I thought. He's not trustworthy. He lies to my face. He's shameless in that respect. I mean, he really dropped Trump in it with that lie about the attack on the residence. So there are a lot of factors here which probably that are annoying Trump. And at the same time, Trump feels very much emboldened. He feels very much like he feels very vindicated by his recent actions, probably very, very encouraged. So, he may well feel now, okay, now's the time to turn up the pressure a little bit on Russia. But having said all that, again, we always come back to the original point with Trump that he is fundamentally well disposed towards Russia for whatever reason. So I wouldn't overestimate the chances of him getting very tough on Russia. I think it reduces the chances of him being particularly friendly or kind to the Russians, as it were. Hopefully he'll just maintain the very modest support he's currently offering to Ukraine, at least keep those sanctions in place and the military support and the military sales to Ukraine that we have at the moment. But certainly I think Trump's attitude towards Putin has probably shifted in the last few weeks in a negative sense because of Putin's obvious weakness and because of his lying.
In Moscow, they keep telling to their own people that sanctions are not working, and at the same time, we really see that the US might put more pressure on Russia, especially as Senator Lindsey Graham published this week that Donald Trump gave a green light to a new possible sanctions package against Russia. What's your take on that? First of all, do you agree that current sanctions, especially with American sanctions, how do they affect Russian economy, especially for this year? Does Russia still strong enough to continue the war against Ukraine this year?
Well, look, Russia always says, sanctions are great for Russia. Sanctions actually help Russia. But at the same time, whenever there's any discussion on any sort of a potential settlement, one of the top priorities for the Russians is the removal of sanctions. So obviously, this talk of sanctions being good for Russia or Russia being indifferent to sanctions is an obvious lie. It's obviously bravado. If they didn't really care about sanctions, they wouldn't make a big deal out of sanctions. They wouldn't ask for them to be removed. But as we see, they always do. They always make that one of their priorities. They say, we must remove sanctions. So we can very comfortably, I think, conclude that sanctions are having a negative impact on the Russian economy and they'd rather not have them. Now, are they enough to force Russia into a settlement, to bring Russia to the negotiating table? Well, I would say no. They're having an impact. We see the Russian economy is struggling. It's difficult to get an absolutely accurate picture of how badly it's struggling because so much has been classified. So many different data points have been classified over the last 4 years because Russia's trying to conceal the state of its economy and the damage is being done to its economy. So difficult to know for sure. But what we do know, what we do see, it's clear that Russia is struggling economically. But this is, again, we've got to come back to the fundamental point of what this war is all about for Russia. This is an historic mission for Putin. He's trying to end Ukrainian statehood and revive the Russian Empire. So he's prepared to sacrifice almost all other national interests to achieve those goals, because he considers them to be absolutely existential for Russia's survival and future as a state and as an empire, essentially. So however bad the economic situation will be, unless it's literally a collapse, I think that Putin will take money from anywhere else in order to feed the war machine, in order to pay for the war. So what we'll see, I imagine, during the current years, we'll see less and less money available in Russia for social payments, for education, healthcare, infrastructure, so on and so forth, in order to pour all the money that's available, the increasingly limited supplies, into the war machine, into funding the invasion of Ukraine. Now that will create pressures domestically, because the Russians will feel, okay, now that the standard of living, the quality of life will go down in Russia itself, and that will have an impact. But I'm not very optimistic about the idea of the Russian people suddenly rising up. I think they've been so so overwhelmingly pacified that's still a long way off.
My last questions about also this Oreshnik situation in Lviv, Oreshnik attacks. Russian officials claim that this missile known as Oreshnik is impossible to intercept. And at the same time, today, ex-Russian President Dmitry Medvedev has threatened European countries with this missile, considering deploying troops to Ukraine. And he posted a video of the attack and basically telling Europeans that it could have, they could see the same consequences for them. First of all, I would like to ask you how dangerous this missile, especially for European countries, and how seriously is Europe still taking these threats from Russian side?
Well, the Oreshnik is not really new technology. It's Cold War technology that's been slightly revamped. There are various different opinions on how dangerous it is. Some people believe it could be shot down. I think it's telling that Russia has used it twice now in Ukraine, and on both occasions it's chosen cities with quite limited air defences. It's not targeted Kyiv. Now that there may be a variety of reasons for that, but one argument would be they don't want to put it to the test against Ukraine's top air defences, which are essentially the cutting-edge air defences internationally, or some of the best, the Patriot systems, for example. So we don't know for sure whether it really is unstoppable, as the Russians say. Some would say it is. Some would certainly disagree with that. But even if it is unstoppable, the idea of using, when you're using it without a nuclear warhead, it's not really any more or less dangerous than any other ballistic missile. So it's really a message. It's all about sending a message. It's a message job in mafia parlance. It's all about sending a clear message, a threat, as it were, to the Europeans. So again, they chose to fire this missile at Lviv this time, in the Lviv region, because that's close to the border with NATO and the EU. So that was a clear message to the Europeans. We can fire at you, and we're not afraid to take the risk of doing so. We're going to fire right close to the border now, almost a shot. It was like a sort of mock execution, as it were, and that was something they very, very deliberately and consciously chose to do, and that's in line with Russia's strategy throughout the war. Russia uses intimidation as a tactic. Putin has used nuclear blackmail, nuclear saber-rattling since the very, very first day of the invasion of Ukraine, repeatedly as a tool to intimidate the West and to scare them off supporting Ukraine and interfering. So again, now we see the Western countries, the European leaders saying, okay, we're going to provide security guarantees for Ukraine, we're going to put troops in Ukraine. Putin responds with yet more very, very thinly veiled nuclear threats, with this Oreshnik strike on the EU-NATO border. So this is going to continue because it works for the Russians. However much the Europeans may feel that Putin is bluffing, they have to take nuclear threats seriously. Their electorates are very, very risk intolerant. Any European leader who was to go up and say in public you know what, I think Putin's bluffing, we're just going to push ahead, would probably be out of office quite soon. It would be a massive scandal in their country if people said, you're putting us at risk of a nuclear war on behalf of a third-party country, i.e. Ukraine. That's irresponsible, that's reckless behaviour. And Putin knows that, so he uses the nuclear threats. But I think we've seen over the last 4 years that these are bluffs. Ukraine has called Putin's bluff again and again and again. You know, I think the most famous occasion was probably in September 2022 when Putin claimed to annex the 4 Ukrainian oblasts and said they are now part of Russia forever. You know, and I will use nuclear weapons to defend them, and I'm not bluffing. Now, a couple of weeks later or a month later, Ukrainian soldiers marched into Kherson and liberated it from Russian rule. And the Russians didn't resort to nuclear weapons, as Putin had just said he would. They retreated back across the Dnipro. You know, and then we've seen similar Russian behaviour in Crimea, where the Russian Black Sea Fleet has retreated from Crimea rather than going for the nuclear option and gone back to Novorossiysk. We saw the Russians even actually downplay the invasion of Russia itself in Kursk last year. No, sorry, 2 years ago now, in fact, a year and a half ago. You know, so again and again, the Ukrainians have exposed the fact that these nuclear threats are a bluff. Again, you know, also September last year, Putin said if the Western powers begin to take, you know, use Western weapons for long-range strikes in Russia, that will mean they're at war with Russia. Again, that is now happening on a quite regular basis. There's no declaration of war from Russia or actions against the West. You know, so we've seen again and again that Putin is all bluff. His nuclear threats are all bluff, but they are something the West has to take seriously. So they'll continue to use it. The question is whether the Western governments and the European powers will allow themselves to be intimidated to the extent that they literally reduce or limit their support for Ukraine. That's not clear now. At the moment, I think they're going to be quite determined to continue with their support and especially their security guarantees. But the Russians will escalate the nuclear threats, as we see already from this Oreshnik, and as you mentioned from Medvedev's comments, where he's quite explicitly threatening them.
Indeed, we saw many red lines from Russia, but nothing happened after their threats. Peter, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you.